just jump in if you have questions, and I think we don't need to stand on ceremony, but just, I think pop in if you have questions or have comments. So, and we'll have opportunity for discussion throughout. So I will turn it back over to Cooper if you wanted to add anything or lead us off.
Sure, thank you, Commissioner. Good afternoon, everybody. Great to see your faces. I just have one quick announcement, and then I'll pass it over to Suzanne and Mary. An announcement about membership. So Karen Rowe is no longer with ODOT, and she was sitting on this committee. In the interim, while we replace our division administrator for delivery and operations, Mac Lind, who was the deputy administrator, will be the interim. And I've asked Mac to sit in these conversations over the next couple of months while we go out for a replacement for that position. So I just wanted to make sure folks were tracking that. And with that, I will pass the mic over to Suzanne.
Let's do a little ping pong here. Amanda, do you want to kick us off with some introductory remarks, and then I'll introduce the team to make the presentation?
Yeah, that sounds great. Thanks, Suzanne. So, hey, everybody, good to see you again. I think I just want to emphasize the importance of transportation electrification in the portfolio of things we're doing, not only for the climate office, but for the agency in general. As we really look towards achieving our climate goals, we have to get to cleaner vehicles and fuels. And this is really one of the key paths to doing that. So we're leaning in pretty hard there. I think we talked to you last time about some of the other things that we're working on within the climate office. I guess I just want to emphasize this is such a big one. For us, one that I'm still kind of continuing to play in and push forward. I also want to brag on Mary for a minute. So Mary just recently received an award for her efforts leading the electrification conversation from the agency. So she's really been doing stellar work there. Mary and Shauna are actually going to be some of the co-conveners for what's known as the Oregon Electric Vehicle Consortium. Mary and Jillian might talk a little bit about that. But that's a group where we're really trying to get everybody to the same table. And I think that's part of what we've talked about as we take on electrification, and the governor's office has really put us in the driver's seat for that, is what is our role and responsibility? It's kind of a new space for state DOTs. So I think, we've started to try to find our niche, try to figure out how we coordinate, collaborate, and recognize there's a boatload of work to do. So how do we really focus our time? How do we focus our energy? And that'll be part of the conversation today. So really excited for that. And I'll kick it back to Suzanne.
Excellent, thank you. Don't have a lot to add to that, just there is certainly a sense of urgency, and recognize that transportation electrification is one of our faster paths to reducing transportation greenhouse gas emissions. With that, I will hand it over to Mary, who is our expert in this field, and with support from Jillian DeMedio. So Mary Brazel is our Transportation Electrification Program Manager, who's leading our EV charging infrastructure deployment and electrification across all modes, including e-bike, we hope, as we were just talking about. Previously, she worked in ODOT's Office of Innovative Funding, spearheading upgrades to the West Coast Electric Highway. And then in Q&A, we'll have support from Jillian, who is our Senior Transportation Electrification Analyst in our Climate Office. And prior to joining ODOT, Jillian was the Assistant Director of the Leading by Example program at the Massachusetts Department of Energy Resources, where she led a multi-agency effort to electrify the state fleet. And I didn't introduce myself. I'm Suzanne Carlson, the new Climate Office Director, and we joined you last month as well. So Mary, go right ahead. And I think Sabrina will we'll start the slideshow.
Yeah, good afternoon. Let's see if we can get the slideshow up. Great, thank you very much. Let me see if I can move my screen around a little bit. No, okay. So anyway, good afternoon, and thank you for the opportunity to share our Transportation Electrification Infrastructure Needs Analysis, which we call TEINA for short, and talk about the challenges and opportunities for ODOT as we implement the findings and grow EV charging infrastructure in Oregon. As you know, ODOT was directed to undertake the TEINA study by Governor Brown in Executive Order 2004, directing state agencies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Next slide. So transportation electrification, this is echoing Amanda's point, among its many benefits is absolutely essential to helping to achieve Oregon's climate goals. About 40% of Oregon's greenhouse gas emissions come from the transportation sector. And our statewide transportation strategy lays out a path for reducing the greenhouse gas emissions in the state through strategies such as supporting more low carbon ways for people to travel, like biking, walking, electric scooters, and e-bikes or transit. But Oregon's greenhouse gas emissions goals stretch to 2050, and the chart in the middle shows that today's trends and policies, the light green line on the top, will reduce emissions but fall far short of Oregon's 2050 goals, the dark green line on the bottom. The colored boxes show where we need to work to close that gap, and we found that the best way to do that is by adopting a mix of policies. But the most significant thing we need to do is to address vehicles and fuels and go electric and make every mile driven cleaner. Next slide. So TEINA looks at charging needs for light duty vehicles, such as cars, trucks, and SUVs, to meet Oregon's statutory goals, which are shown on this slide to ramp up from 50,000 ZEVs or zero emission vehicles in 2020 to 2.5 million ZEVs in 15 years. Oregon has a goal of about 90% of light duty vehicle purchases to be ZEVs by 2035, of all new light duty vehicle purchases, sorry. TEINA considers the charging needs for light duty vehicles, but also for medium and heavy duty vehicles, such as transit and school buses, delivery vehicles and long haul trucking, as well as electric micromobility, such as e-scooters and e-bikes. And the study pays particular attention to rural and underserved communities. And in this work, we are identifying the scale and rate of needed EV infrastructure expansion, priority locations and types, challenges and opportunities, and policies and implementation actions. Next slide. So our consultant team, Kittleson and Associates, Rocky Mountain Institute, HDR, and Forth, started by looking at existing conditions in Oregon and compared this to other leading EV states. To no one's surprise, we found that the light duty EVs and public EV charging infrastructure are concentrated in major cities along Oregon's Interstate 5 corridor, in the Willamette Valley, and along the coast, revealing major gaps in EV charging infrastructure in the rural parts of the state. Next slide. Our team used scenario analysis, modeling, and input from 12 different stakeholder listening sessions or focus groups, exploring electric vehicle charging infrastructure needs of 9 use cases to forecast ZEV adoption in 2025, 2030, and 2035, and determine when, where, and what chargers are needed to support this exponential growth in EVs. Participants in all the listening sessions expressed 5 common concerns: high upfront costs for EVs and charging infrastructure. It's hard to find a way to charge if you live in an apartment complex. Everyone wants a robust, statewide, reliable network of EV charging along highways. The public user charging experience needs to be better. It needs to be consistent, reliable, easy to use, open to all, and offer transparent and easy to understand pricing, as easy as buying gasoline. And it's still hard to find the right kind of EV to meet your needs for many people in Oregon. Next slide. So this slide shows heat maps revealing the modeling results of the EV charging infrastructure needs for all 9 use cases. TEINA envisions that expansive development in EV charging infrastructure will be critical to provide Oregonians with confidence that EV charging is as ubiquitous and as convenient as fueling with gasoline. Across all sectors, there's an extraordinary need for charging infrastructure growth, not only by 2035, but a 5-fold increase is needed in just the next 5 years. The public charging needs of urban, rural, and corridor light-duty vehicle use cases are an order of magnitude greater than all other use cases, as is shown in the box in the upper right. Home charging is critical as well, but decreases in importance over time. Right now, TEINA assumes that about 90% of EVs are charged at home bases today, but only 60% will be charged at home in 2035, reflecting the expectation of increasing adoption of zero-emission vehicles by residents of apartments and condos, and their reliance on public level 2 workplace and community DC fast charging hubs. Next slide. What are the key takeaways? More public charging is found near urban areas where more EV drivers live and in the western part of the state, yielding rural charging deserts. Urban charging deserts arise too for those living in apartments and townhomes who may not have access to a parking space, let alone a place to plug in an electric vehicle. To achieve equitable charging access for all Oregonians, infrastructure investment needs to focus on low income, Black, Indigenous, people of color, and rural communities. Private sector EV charging companies are hesitant to install charging in certain urban neighborhoods, nor along rural corridors in communities where there are fewer EVs. Already, so public sector investment is needed to address rural and equity concerns. Contemporary studies suggest that charging infrastructure needs to be in place 2 or more years prior to EV adoption to address range anxiety and persuade people that charging will be as easy as filling up with gasoline. And it takes a village acting urgently, doing business differently, especially utilities. Utility actions and outlook are critical to manage the fuel supply, speed installations, and reduce cost barriers to public charging caused by low utilization or demand charges. Next slide. So we developed a vision to meet this challenge, to provide Oregonians with confidence that EV charging will be as ubiquitous and as convenient as fueling with gasoline. And we identified 6 key goals to support this vision: rapid deployment of electric vehicle charging infrastructure, ensuring equitable access, especially for those residing in apartments, to address rural and geographic balance, making charging user-friendly, convenient, standardized, and safe, ensuring that everybody benefits from low electric fuel costs, heightened utility engagement, and ensuring that foundational policies are in place, such as policies addressing workforce development, EV-ready building codes and ordinances, and removing barriers to micromobility. Next slide. So what are our next steps? We're working on a zero emission vehicle charging infrastructure deployment strategy to refine TEINA's focus over a kind of a more narrow snapshot over the next 5 years. And I'm going to skip to the 3rd bullet here and talk about pursuing collaboration. This is what Amanda was referring to as our role. We're continuing to pursue our vision created in the TEINA study by collaborating with others in the public sector, the private sector, and nonprofits to build education and awareness of EVs, develop and communicate incentives, encourage and plan for EV charging infrastructure, and identify policies to speed adoption and eliminate roadblocks to an EV future. And we're helping the state by lead by example. So investing in EVs in our own fleets and EV charging infrastructure for employees and visitors. We're also pursuing 3 supplemental analyses, one focusing on hydrogen fuel cell opportunities, looking at e-micromobility challenges and opportunities, and making the TEINA analyses more user-friendly for planners. But most importantly, ODOT aims to secure funding and make equitable investments, which I'll discuss over the next few slides. Next slide. So 2 weeks after the Climate Office finished the TEINA study, we submitted a $17 million grant application to the US Department of Transportation for an EV charging infrastructure initiative we call Plugging in Oregon. This is a 3-pronged approach with different programs designed to meet unique needs for specific charging gaps in communities, the urban core, and along corridors. The Plugging in Oregon framework stems from 2 key findings of the TEINA study. There are major EV charging infrastructure gaps throughout Oregon, particularly in rural, BIPOC, and low-income communities, and significant public sector investment is needed to plug these gaps. Through this initiative, ODOT is setting aside transportation operating funds to develop a charging infrastructure incentive program serving communities. And we are also actively pursuing federal funding to support corridor and urban core charging needs. Each program aims to ensure equitable access for EV charging for all Oregonians. And I'll provide a little bit of an overview of each program in the next few slides. So next slide. The corridor program aims to install DC fast chargers in charging deserts along our highly traveled corridors. Looking at the map on the right, you can see 6 major corridors in Oregon, 3 that run east-west and 3 that run north-south. The yellow dots indicate where public DC fast chargings currently are in place. They're concentrated in the urban areas like Portland and Salem, up and down I-5, and some along the US 101 coast. But there are glaring gaps along other major corridors, particularly in central and eastern Oregon. So the orange dots on this map along our corridors show our proposed approach, at least in this RAISE grant application, to fill in these gaps and ensure charging stations are available at least every 75 miles along these major corridors. And that's phase 1. Phase 2, our target is every 25 to 50 miles. Next slide.
Before you leave that slide,
Okay.
could you go back, please? Thank you. So this is part of the grant that you submitted to federal, and what's the timing on that? And
We should hear by November 22nd.
What, do you have any early indications about the success? No.
We have no idea. I mean, I don't.
If we were to get this grant, is there a prioritization among these corridors? If I were to give you my 2 cents, as you might imagine, it seems that we need to be prioritizing central and eastern Oregon because there is no fast charging, and start there. But I don't know if you've gotten that far.
Yeah, well, if you can see the orange dots on here, these are where we would propose. And so most of them are in central and eastern Oregon, some along 20, but there's really only 1 or 2 along the coast.
I see. It's kind of small on my screen.
Yeah,
so
it
you.
is. I'm sorry. It's one of those things where it needs to be needs to pop a little bit more. But all those orange dots are doing that, and we agree that we need to prioritize central and eastern Oregon. But we're also trying to have a major focus that says you don't go more than 75 miles without having a charging station in phase 1, with the goal of ultimately getting to phase 2 and 3, where it's 25 to 50 miles. If we get if the federal bipartisan infrastructure bill occurs, if we don't win the WAVES grant, we may be able to implement this as well with the federal funding from that infrastructure bill.
And if we get either of the funding, what's the timeframes to complete that work?
They give you quite a bit of time to actually get it all finished. I believe, Jillian, you correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that we have actually until 2029 to have everything in place in the ground. I think there's a hurdle before then where we have to have funds committed. So there's, in my understanding from this grant that we've applied for is the same grant that we applied for the West Coast Electric Highway. And it had a different name then, it was Tiger 2, but now it's called RAISE, which is Rebuilding America's Infrastructure with Sustainability and Equity. So my understanding is it takes somewhere around 6 months or so, at least, to negotiate the contract with the federal government. And then you can kind of move forward from then.
Can I ask about the locations of the charging stations? Are you anticipating using public rights of way or partnering with other providers?
Mostly partnering with other providers. We try to, there's both a focus in our RAISE grant application and also in any of the federal funding that really wants to, that encourages private sector involvement and public-private partnerships. So we're focusing on that. Let me just say, these are illustrative. These are not definitive locations, but they, we did try and identify various locations where there could be an opportunity in a location that would be suitable for electric vehicle charging. We've had some preliminary discussions with some of the investor-owned electric utilities to try and initiate a process to identify with them where there are, where excess grid capacity is along these corridors so we can make them more cost effective.
I was just curious from a policy position whether normal fuel stations would challenge electric vehicle charging stations in state rights of way, and just how that whole thing would work. So it's mostly a curiosity. Also, are you anticipating the user fee being collected by road usage charge or mileage fee, as opposed to setting up some kind of a taxing collection system at the charging station?
The charging station would be, you would pay for your fuel at the charging station just the same way you would pay for your fuel at a gasoline station. I think the road usage charging, that's a separate issue. That, you know,
So that would have to come along at some point of how they would pay to use the transportation system.
right. So it's, some states have tried to put a tax onto the utility kilowatt hour charge, but Oregon is, as you know, very committed to exploring the road usage charging system. And, you know, by the time that this kind of builds out and is more active with a greater percentage of electric vehicles on the roadways, my bet is that we'd be, you know, moving
Using
into that
that
road usage
vehicle,
charging.
yeah. Okay, thank you.
Mary,
Do you mind if I jump in there?
sorry, go ahead, Amanda. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Shauna. Appreciate it. So a couple thoughts, Paul, on your questions. One is there definitely is a policy conversation to be had around charging within public road right of way and at rest areas. So I kind of include that in there together. There's certainly some opportunities there, but there are some federal barriers to that. There's also some state barriers to that. That we need to overcome. So that's definitely at the forefront of a lot of policy conversations that we and others are pretty heavily engaged in right now, to see if we can open that opportunity up more than what's available today. I think in terms of kind of the competition side with other fuel providers like gas companies, to date, it hasn't really been a problem, except potentially when we're talking about like rest areas and services there in the competition. So that issue at least hasn't been kind of a big problem. And then overall, I think our strategies are to try to look for public-private partnerships. I think we have made a distinction, but I'd be curious your thoughts and reactions to this, between our pricing programs and this, in that this would be around refueling or the cost of operating the personal vehicle as opposed to the impacts on the roadway system. So as we think about pricing and true cost pricing, we're looking at ways ultimately to bring together tolling, congestion pricing, Orego into the same, you know, user pay system that pays for the cost of the roadways and the environmental impacts or congestion impacts of those vehicles. We really haven't looked at it from a perspective of the refueling costs of the vehicle. We were keeping that pretty separate, but happy to hear any thoughts that you might have on that.
That makes sense. I like the concept, because then you can manage your prices around equity issues, et cetera, as you see fit.
So I just need to clarify something, and I think I know the answer to this, but I feel like there maybe it needs to be just articulated. ODOT is not planning on owning and operating and maintaining these stations, correct?
Correct.
So
We're not planning, and that, you know, we get to that when we get to the questions. That's the foundational thing. We're anticipating public-private partnerships, grants, rebates to get the infrastructure in the ground. Especially the federal government funding is highly directive about supporting the private sector or public-private partnerships.
So
ODOT
Mary,
is not planning to own, operate, or maintain.
right. So Mary, you envision ODOT giving grants to 7-Elevens or Fred Meyer's to say, you know, here guys, you guys are going to install these, use whatever vendors you want, but here are the parameters around what needs to be installed in your public parking lot. and it's not going to be in the public right of way. I think, Paula, that's where like the disconnect is, because it's going to be a privately owned and maintained piece of infrastructure. So the state won't have any say on like those road usage charges or money having to go back to the highway trust fund or anything. I just want to make sure I have that right.
Well, the state could apply some kind of a user fee to those vehicles. It doesn't have to be connected to them charging their vehicle.
On the vehicle side, yes.
Yeah. Okay.
But they could do that to any vehicle.
Sure.
I'm talking about the deployment of the charging infrastructure.
I see. Yeah.
Right, and Shauna, to your point, let me get through the best couple of slides, and then let's keep going with this conversation. But if we could go to the next slide, it'll talk about the urban core, which.
Well, and Mary, I saw that Amber had her hand up too, and I don't know.
Oh, I'm sorry.
If you want to take that now or wait.
So I just had a question just to follow up to Shauna's comments, which is related to the utilization of DBEs and or minority contractors, and regardless whether or not this is grants, for a public-private partnership, you can create opportunities for minority contractors. So have you thought about that? And if so, how are you going to do that?
I would just say that we have not gotten to the point of trying to actually get the grant programs defined and ready to go out the door. It's certainly something that would be of interest. I know there's also concern around paying prevailing wages and other things like that that would be of import in these kinds of grant programs. But I don't have a good answer for that just yet. We haven't gotten to that stage.
Okay, so I guess let me ask a policy question to someone, I don't know who. So is it the case that, I mean, the prevailing wage is a workforce issue? I'm asking the question related to contracting and the utilization of firms. So the question I have is, for a public-private partnership, for these public-private partnerships, will you incorporate in your public-private partnership agreements the requirement to use DBEs and or if you use state funds, you can have a local program? So that's my question.
So Amber, I don't know if this is relevant, but having just recently completed the West Coast Electric Highway RFP, points were given for using DBE firms. And I don't know if this will mimic the West Coast Electric Highway RFP process or how points will be allocated, but that's the way ODOT did that with a program that they announced earlier this year.
Yeah, so I would just say across, thank you, Shauna, for adding that. I think across the agency, we're leaning into our DBE goals and applying it to everything that we can apply it to. I think we are trying to be somewhat mindful depending on what funding we actually get in the color of money, given Buy America and other requirements, what qualified firms are out there to do some of those things. And the expertise, I think, is gaining in this sector, but is more nascent than some other things. So I think we'll just have to strike that balance, but I think we'll certainly put those targets there. We'll try to, contact firms. And I think part of this is building the capacity within some of those DE firms as well, where we can.
Which is something that I've worked on and I would love to continue working on with anybody on the call who wants to work on it.
Yeah, and Shauna, I should call out PGE has been doing a great workforce development effort as well across the state in this whole transportation electrification work stream. And we've been in touch with them and they have been involved in the TEINA study effort, because workforce development is another area that we really need to focus on.
I just want to, I know you want to keep going, Mary. I just want to add one more thing on this point. I think it's really important. as ODOT is the convening agency for this work, I realize y'all have a lot on your plate, but I think it's really important to make sure that you are also the convening agency for articulating the workforce needs associated with TE in the state, even though you're not a workforce development agency. But it's incumbent upon you to make sure that whoever is in charge of workforce development understands the growth opportunities and the needs to engage with union and non-union training centers. And the utilities are ready to help with this work. I mean, I know that PGE has money available through Clean Fuels to help fund it. So I really want to, I can't emphasize that enough.
Great, great.
And I want to echo what Shauna is saying, and I want to, if there's any way I can be involved in the work Shauna is describing, I want to be involved too, because the reason why I'm asking the question and I'm pressing on the DBE issue is because the DBE issue is the way you get to workforce, and the two are intimately tied. And so you can't build availability around workforce without focusing on DBE, and you focus on DBE in order to expand the capacity. So I'm just making sure that ODOT is going to look at this as a way to give DBEs an opportunity to do new scopes of work for which they haven't done before.
Amber, I agree completely. And from my perspective, and Shauna too, I think that this is a great opportunity for us to integrate our part of our strategic plan equity goals into this program. And I, for one, would be advocating that at the OTC level. And so I welcome both of your expertise and input in it as we go forward.
Mary, your turn.
So I was going to say, you know, we're kind of going into all the discussions, and I'm trying to be mindful of the time. So I'm going to go really quickly through the last couple of slides, which talk about two other aspects of the plugging in Oregon concept. One is the urban core, which is aiming to address urban charging deserts, primarily in BIPOC and low income communities, because most EV drivers today charge up at home, but that's only possible because they own a single family home with a garage, and people with lower incomes who rent apartments don't always have access to either parking or a place to charge an EV. So as EV ownership spreads beyond the early adopters, we're going to need a stronger public network of community DC fast charging hubs and level 2 charging, especially in urban centers, because about a quarter of Oregonians live in apartments or other multifamily housing, where putting charging in place is often much more expensive and complicated. So we envision that this program will fund banks of level 2 charging and community DC fast charging hubs located near areas with a high density of apartments, rentals, and disadvantaged persons. And I'm just going to show you briefly this next slide, which gives you our current analytical approach to targeting infrastructure in these priority areas. So you're looking at 3 different maps of Gresham, Oregon, which is a city on the outskirts of Portland. And it's a good illustration of charging deserts because despite being the 4th largest city in Oregon with a population of over 100,000, there are currently no public DC fast chargers available within the city limits. Not for long, great. So our goal for this program is to provide public level 2 and DC fast charging for those who are likely to have less access to at-home charging. So we wanted to look at a number of criteria to identify these populations, such as low income, BIPOC, disadvantaged persons, renters, residents of multi-unit dwellings like apartments, because we know those are the populations that are unlikely to have easy access to at-home charging. So we compiled our criteria and created a series of GIS maps. And the first map on the left displays ODOT's equity index, which is an index of disadvantaged persons considering factors such as age, income, ethnicity, disability, English proficiency, and other factors. And using block group data, the map goes from light to dark blue, with the dark blue indicating areas with the highest numbers of disadvantaged persons. The map in the middle displays rental unit density in Gresham by census tract, again with the darker areas indicating a high density of rental units. The third map looks at the density of multi-unit dwellings in Gresham, with darker areas indicating a high density of apartments. So it's really helpful to look at these criteria side by side, and you can easily see that many of the areas with a high density of one criteria also have a high density of another, or all three. So our hope with this analysis is to identify areas where we would try and target infrastructure investment to enable us to have the highest impact, making sure public charging is available to people who need it the most. Next slide, and I only got 2 more slides, I think. So plugging in Oregon community, it's really important to also fund and create opportunities for communities to have access to charging infrastructure. And ODOT has committed to funding a community charging program, incentive program with transportation operating funds. And we plan to introduce it next year. And it's largely aimed at addressing both urban, but mostly rural charging deserts. And it's important to consider the rural charging deserts. Again, showing you this information before, you can see in the map on the top, shows Oregon's biggest urban areas in yellow and also with the circles around them. And down below, you can see where the charging currently exists. So it's no surprise that it's concentrated where the greatest heavily populated areas are, especially within those urban limits. But about 1/3 of Oregonians, or 1.5 million people, live in rural and frontier areas outside the major urban areas. So for geographic balance, it's important that there's a focus on rural charging deserts. And we're anticipating in these communities funding primarily level 2 charging stations at locations like workplace, tourist destinations, apartments, stop and shop locations. Next slide. And so, you know, all the grant funding is great, but it only goes so far. We fully recognize the importance of outreach and education to make sure folks know about our incentive programs and technical assistance to ensure that those with limited resources or expertise are able to, you know, complete the applications and get the help they need for the funding available. So we consider these elements extremely important for a comprehensive program and essential to its success. And then the last slide just goes over questions, but you all have plenty of other questions. We had 3 questions for you, given that we are giving funding out and we won't own and operate these stations. Other ideas to prioritize investment in previously disinvested and underserved communities beyond targeting geographic locations, and how to make sure across all the other actors in the state who also will be investing in charging infrastructure, like the investor-owned utilities, who are also looking at things from an equity focus. How do we make sure we are complementary and we use our funds in the best way possible? And the last, we also addressed a little bit before, ODOT delivery. You know, all the federal funding comes with a lot of requirements. And if the bipartisan infrastructure bill is passed, just one of the funding streams will be $52 million in funding to the state of Oregon for EV charging infrastructure. And so we need to make sure we ensure that ODOT is prepared to efficiently run with this opportunity. We're going to encounter increased workloads in the Office of Innovative Funding or NEPA review of charging infrastructure sites, along with reviews for historical and cultural artifacts. And just for the RAISE grant that we showed you, just for the $17 million RAISE grant, the estimate of time that ODOT would take to do that is about 12 months, even assuming that the sites would qualify for categorical exemptions. So there's a host of other things, from RFPs to procurement, to signage, to right-of-way issues, to basic oversight and administration. With all these exciting funding opportunities come many challenges. So how do we streamline processes and remove bottlenecks within ODOT? And now I turn it back to you all.
I unsurprisingly have a lot of thoughts. So I would recommend, so first of all, having, completed a few federal grants, the reporting requirements are significant. And so I think that it will be incumbent upon ODOT to really choose partners wisely and to choose partners that can develop, where you can really gain benefit from, development of more than one site at a time. So, picking private companies that are interested, that have locations in various places. I think thinking through whether you want to work with an Electrify America to develop, own and operate those sites and give some of these grant funds to them. Those are all sort of academic questions that you're going to have to answer. I would encourage you to start thinking about those now so that you can hit the ground running. And some of the other issues, Mary, that you articulated around signage, right of way, like all of those things, those are all questions that need to be answered regardless of whether funding comes through from the feds or not. And so I think those are useful exercises for ODOT to embark on now or yesterday. I think having gone through the West Coast Electric Highway process, finding one owner operator for all those sites is not possible. And so thinking through how many owners and operators do you want and what kind of reporting administrative burden does that put on you to manage those relationships and make sure that they're doing what they said they would do. Those are things that you guys really need to think through now. As far as bottlenecks, and one thing PGE has done that maybe you guys have done too is I would think really clearly about what ODOT can actually have, what ODOT actually has control over and what ODOT can exercise some insider control over, and then what is squarely outside of ODOT's realm. So ODOT cannot impact the number of EVs that are purchased unless, strike that. ODOT cannot impact the kinds of EVs that are on the market. That's up to the OEMs. Can ODOT start to bring money to the table for rebates for vehicles? Maybe. Can ODOT provide a rebate to any kind of business that wants to install charging infrastructure on their private property? Yeah. So I think starting to sort of understand the universe over which you have easy control will help you kind of pick that low-hanging fruit. And I also just really appreciate that visual, the map. And I think those types of issues are coming up in PUC and DEQ proceedings. And to the extent we can use them and start to speak from, start to sing from one songbook around underserved communities, where they are, who they serve, that would be, I think, beneficial to lots of agencies.
Shauna, I don't want to cut you off because I think we didn't leave enough time for this topic for discussion. It is a big topic. So I'd like to suggest that we think about, if people are comfortable with this, bring it back at the beginning of next meeting and allocate some time to provide that feedback. Because I think we just went a little bit long on presentation and not enough time on discussion. So would people be comfortable with that approach? Okay, because I also know that we have time allocated for Nicotris, and I don't want to cut her too short. So why don't we do that? We'll table this discussion, give people time to think about it, and then we'll bring it back next time, because this is really a critical component in our strategic planning, and I really want to get the wisdom of this group.
So Commissioner Smith, if you don't mind, we'd be happy to come back and talk again. A couple things that maybe just for the group to noodle on in terms of questions or kind of reactions to what's been said. I would say, we're really taking the tactic of not, to Shauna's point earlier, not being in the business of owning and operating electric stations. We are trying to incentivize and push and really drive the market super hard. And so that's kind of the space that we're playing in. I would also share we're very focused right now on light duty vehicles. That doesn't mean we're ignoring medium and heavy duty like trucks, but we haven't been spending as much time there. And I think that recognition is important too, because it's a big piece of the pie we haven't really talked much about here. And I would say we're going for grants, I think in ways recognizing that the need is there. And I think what you've heard from the conversation today is we haven't figured out all the in-between should we be successful in those. And so I think the feedback just today on the DVEs and other comments have been really helpful as we think about how we might structure something should we be successful. So thanks for the feedback. It's already been helpful, and look forward to the conversation next go around.
All right, well, I think we're transitioning then to Nicotris. So thank you, Mary, really appreciate it. I guess we'll see you next time, so you're not off the hook yet, but appreciate it, everyone on the team, Suzanne, Jillian, Amanda, and let's transition over to social equity. I see the slides. Nicotris, over to you.
Awesome, thank you so much. I'm just gonna go through a few slides pretty quickly. I think that the conversation around social equity would be more useful to CIAC and to the Office of Social Equity and to ODOT, because it is still in a place where how does the CIAC make sure that we're doing the continuous improvement as indicated. If you go to the next slide, what I just want to remind you of is the impact statement. So these are the 6 things that will be true about ODOT because of the work we do or have done from 2020 to 2030. What we're working on right now is applying metrics to these spaces. Metrics already exist in some places, but some places they do not. And because that is the easiest way to know whether or not you have made progress in any way, shape, or form. We're working on what it looks like to apply metrics from a policy, from a progress, from a day-to-day standpoint. That process has just started, as in it started yesterday. But this is the end. And again, these are reminders. Went over this when I was here in November. What I do want to spend some time on is the social equity lens, because I know it's been brought up a few times and it is kind of where we're starting. So if you go to the next slide, most of what I'll talk about today is really just trying to unpack the social equity lens for you all. The reason we have one at all is because it helps us operate with urgency, transparency, and accountability. One thing about working around in social equity is for ODOT, or really for any entity or agency, it can't be something that our Office of 3 does. It can't be something that comes out of some special Office of Social Equity budget. It has to be something that everybody does. It has ownership and understanding of in terms of their day-to-day space. One of the biggest ways that we're going to get to those impact statements is a shift in our mental model. Like, how do we think about things? Who are we thinking about? How do we go about problem solving? That is, in all honesty, much different to how we've done it in the past. So the social equity lens allows us to interrupt bias. It allows us to pivot some longstanding institutional patterns. It informs our resource allocation, evaluates our investments, and it guides our decisions and actions. On the next slide, you'll be able to see like how we're like digging into that pretty deeply. So what's the decision? Who is being considered? What is making the decision, and how? Like, is it a group? Is it a advisory group plus somebody at ODOT? Is it our owner's rep? Like, there's a lot of things that push into making a decision. And is there an entity or rule or policy that is making a decision for us, and how? What are some assumptions about the root of the problem? What data or information is available and being used? And what is the benefit and burden distribution, and to whom? I offer all of this because oftentimes, or what we're actually creating is more questions every single time we offer resources and tools to the agency, which is why the metrics are really important, because there's no checklist for equity. It's a process. And so we're embedding it and baking it into this processes and systems we already have. So in doing that, it does consistently offer more questions. A good example is right now we're working on the engagement toolkit, which is really putting together, based on what questions you answer how, there's easily 85 questions that need to be embedded into this automatic system where it pulls you through what your engagement should look like in any given moment. And for any project or program. And so it really is digging deep into the questions. On the next slide, it does provide our 4 top level questions. So if somebody said, what is ODOT social equity lens? This is what I would point to, right? There are 4 questions. Also, if you hear someone talking about the social equity lens, and I know that's something we'll talk about a little bit because this has been embedded into our cost estimating tool, and it is how the alternative delivery system team is looking at social equity, is how do you embed these things? These 4 questions easily open up into 20, 25 questions. We did the exercise with one team and there were 10 to 12 questions, sub-questions, as they opened up thinking about these 4. So these are our very high level questions that allow teams to really continue to dig into what they're doing, why they're doing it, and how social equity could influence the outcome. I do want to draw some attention to our 4th question, which I think is one that does speak to some of the things that we're really pushing. It speaks to public-private partnerships. It speaks to a partnership and outreach strategy that we're developing. It speaks to how we engage with the public in terms of community-based organizations and community members who stand alone or represent certain neighborhoods, because oftentimes ODOT is at the intersection of a lot of different agencies and what they're doing and how they're doing it. And so if there's an opportunity for us to work to increase safety or access or to address a disparity that might not be getting from A to B, even though we know getting from A to B does easily intersect with housing, education, employment, and healthcare. And so we want to make sure that in doing that, we are thinking about those ways. And is there something we could do, or is there a partner that we need to ensure is engaged in that space? On the next slide, it kind of just digs into how you can, actually, that is not what the next slide says. The next slide talks about historically excluded communities, as that's the verbiage that we're using the most. If you see anything come out of the Office of Social Equity, it will most times say historically excluded communities. What we do know is that also in some documents throughout the agency, you'll see communities of concern, you'll see vulnerable communities, you'll also see marginalized populations, and all of those things are correct. Historically excluded communities is umbrella to all of those things. So none of the other ones are incorrect, right? We're thinking about communities of concern, you're concerned of what, right? Which is why we talk about historically excluded as an umbrella term. What is the concern we're talking about in that space? Vulnerable to what is the same thing. So I know there was, things that come to my mind is there's a team working right now thinking about pedestrian injuries and crashes, and it was like, so which word should we use? It's like, what are you talking about? And we're really talking very specifically to communities who are vulnerable to pedestrian injuries. And so they used vulnerable populations because they're talking about vulnerable to a thing. And so just to unpack that a little bit, this is the definition of historically excluded and why we use it, and points to that in all of the documents of the Office of Social Equity. The next slide does dig into a little bit of the process of how we help somebody get through a question. And so on the very bottom left-hand side, in what ways does this address the needs expressed by historically excluded communities? What are the benefits and burdens of those communities? These are the questions that we asked in a conversation to really assess, examine the data, engage and plan, think about implementation and measuring success just for that question, which produced more questions. And so it's just an example of how those 4 are very high level, with the thought of as teams go through this work, as individuals go through this work in their day-to-day processes, we will get to base level or foundational issues. And then the next slide talks about a little bit, kind of a follow-up really, because Mary just went over this too. This is our map, our social equity index map. And so you see the lightest blue is where you will see the least amount of disparity based on social equity, and the darkest blue is the highest. We take 5 categories into consideration based on the American Community Survey. This is still based on 2019. 2020 is going to be very tricky. And so we are looking at if we need to switch our data set, which would then still just bake into the map. But because 2020's American Community Survey Block groups is considered experimental, And this also has not been released yet. It's supposed to be released by the end of November. We don't know if it makes sense to plug that in. It might make sense to wait a year because their year, they come out every year. And this is the end, but it also might make sense to switch to a different platform altogether based on some mapping groups that we've been talking to in other agencies. But in the darkest blue, 5 categories we're thinking about are the intersection of age over 65, first language or native language of choice not being English, income or considering people who are living in poverty or below the federal poverty level, as well as ability, people living with disability or different abilities, and then finally thinking about race, nationality, and ethnicity. And so the map is externally facing, so anyone could use it right now. It is pretty basic. All of the lines drawn on here also are pretty ODOT. So as you look at the layers, this is the base layer. These red lines are direct delivery and operations lines. When you go to the map online, you also can see the lines for our acts. You also can see the lines for our DMV regions as well. So there's different ways for us to look at it. And then finally, I think there's a slide that just says, so what, now what? And so we are working on the social equity blueprint. Every day it gets a little more complicated and complex, but we are definitely working on it. What we've been doing up until this point is ensuring that, one, all the tools and resources that ODOT needs, like immediately, right? Like we're really in spaces where, yep, we're working to develop practice and strategy. We're also very key to day-to-day decision-making, reflection, and focused conversation. I just want to remind you again that our team is very small. There are 3 of us and our agency is 4,700 people. And so we've been working on those very tactical spaces, in those tactical spaces. The other thing we've been doing is making sure that we communicate across the enterprise. So I know in your letter, I linked the DEI action plan that came up from the governor's office. We were involved in that. And we know that the work that we're doing aligns with it. And now we want to make sure that it aligns in words. So the strategies you see on the right-hand side are strategies directly from that plan that we knew we could tackle and we're starting to tackle. And so now we'll put those in our 3 buckets of engagement, economics, and culture to really think about metrics. And individually, we want anybody inside the agency to be able to look at the plan, the blueprint, and see exactly where they fit in. This is what I should be working on. This is how. And going through these, there are things that I want to point out very specifically. So in terms of thinking about like contract equity or improving state procurement process, some things that we're working on right now. I know that statewide delivery came to the last CIAC meeting. And so utilizing the social equity lens as part of the cost estimating tools that are inside of scoping, and thinking about it in terms of the decision-making tree that happens when we're thinking about what type of alternative delivery could be used in a space. So they've spent a lot of time over since your last meeting, making sure that that's included, the equity lens is included in that space. We're also making sure that in terms of the state procurement process, we're looking at partial pay. So we have definitely seen issues where subs are not getting paid as fast as their work is done, and realize that that is not a prompt pay legislative issue. Instead, it is the way that invoices come in and how invoices are approved. So we're working with FHWA as well as training, hopefully shifting our curriculum a little bit around how we train ODOT employees in terms of looking for the things that we would be able to possibly improve a little bit faster so we can get partial pay on some of those invoices, which is a issue for both primes and our subs, because some primes are floating that payment and shouldn't have to, and then some cannot, and therefore subs are not getting paid as fast. Yeah, I am. I'm trying to stop saying prompt pay because I feel like it's really confusing to people. So it is prompt subcontractor pay, which is why I'm calling it partial of the invoice. We should probably land on some language. That would be a continuous improvement thing, because prompt pay does definitely mean something else. And I feel like it's confusing some of our conversations. But we are talking about prompt pay for subcontractors on an invoice. And so I'm going to stop there. I think the last slide was the questions that I offered in terms of, are there areas of the department you're concerned or have not considered economic impact of stakeholders? There's also a lot more that we're working on. And so this presentation really just dug into the equity lens, because I think that's what you've heard the most about, and they are seeing implemented in the most spaces. So I wanted to make sure I could talk about that and explain how we got there and what it was and how people are using it. But these are again, the buckets. So engagement, are there any programmatic or discipline specific areas where ODOT's not engaging? Do you have any concerns about ODOT's excitement, resistance, or progress towards equity? And then are in areas where you have questions or need more information. So I want to definitely open it up for conversation, because I know that I have presented longer than ideal.
One thing that you shared was the map and the different layers available on that map. And I'm just curious to know, when was the map developed and how might we use that as a resource for other agencies looking to kind of looking at the same, targeting the same communities?
Yeah, so the map was developed probably about a year ago, less than a year, the end of last year, I'll do that. The end of last year, calendar year. Yes, we can. There's an equity mapping, there's a mapping like subgroup for the entire enterprise that has seen that map and is looking at it. We're also about to join or start a conversation around engagement just in general with the Office of Cultural Change at the enterprise level, as well as OHA and DHS, because at the end of the day, we're all engaging the same people because we're engaging the whole state. And so figuring out how we can streamline that. We've used the map mostly to help us understand how equity looks, right? It has also helped us shape the conversation around the fact that when we talk about social equity, we are talking about geography because it's usually been two separate questions. So when you look at those 5 social demographics, you also are talking about people, and oftentimes talking about people who live everywhere throughout the state, rural, urban, metropolitan, suburban, like that's how we've used it at this point. But we are trying to strengthen it, and while using it with other agencies as well as DAS.
Any way you might be able to add DEQ and the PUC to the list of agencies that, or just from an awareness standpoint, because they're also looking to engage communities through stakeholder outreach. And again, just like you said, we're working to engage all the same people. So
PUC, and who was the other one?
DEQ.
Okay. I feel like DEQ is at that table, but I will definitely at the this mapping table, but I'll definitely double check. Other than that, it all looks good and we're all improved and continuous, and we can.
Amber, I think you have a question.
Yeah, I just have a comment. So my comments are really directed to Commissioner Smith. Commissioner Smith, I just want to say that, I do change management for a living, and the work that Nakatris and Director Strickler has been doing over the past year or so is really outstanding. And the two, I could give you a list of 10 significant policy changes that have happened in the last year since Nakatris and Director Strickler have come on board. But the top 2 that she identified are the number 2 issues that will help address economic parity for minority contractors, and that's addressing partial pay as well as alternative procurement delivery methods. That being said, I do, for you, Commissioner, you represent the leadership to support DOT in this regard. And one of the things that she highlighted is that there's 4,700 employees for ODOT, and there are 3 Office of Social Equity staff. And there needs to be a consideration for the types of resources that are brought to bear to support the strategic action plan. So that's one thing. And the other thing is, I would just encourage you, Madam Chair, to also encourage the OTC to require a variety of equity techniques and to support NCATRIS and the leadership in making these kinds of changes. So anyways, I just want to thank you. And I just am really encouraging Commissioner Smith of the work that you're doing in this regard.
Thank you. I really appreciate your comments, and I too share the concern that a team of 3 with the number of employees we have is not enough. And I have had conversations with the NCATRIS about, is she getting the resources that she needs, and she's building her team. But it is, you know, she's done an amazing job in the year or so, year and a half that she's been here. And I think we just need to continue to support her. And I agree with you that more support is going to move the needle in a way that the OTC has directed in our strategic plan. So your comments are well taken.
Well, and I guess I would say, I would just kind of flip that a little bit, Commissioner, which is oftentimes when we look at equity, we look at the Office of Equity to help solve the problem. And it's not the Office of Equity that needs to solve the problem. It's ODOT that needs to solve the problem, which means it's Cooper, it's other parts of the leadership. And we have to peel the onion in an entirely different way, which it is about resources, but it's also about thinking differently. And it's about looking at, we have all these projects, in which case, can we look at ways to embed approaches and techniques that allow resources that can be brought to bear to support NCATRIS and all of the other work to achieve those outcomes. It's just a different way of looking at it.
If I may just chime in real quick, and I see Amanda, you have your hand up. I think this is a great conversation, great points, Amber. You know, my 2 cents is I do think, and we continue to have conversations, NCATRIS and I and others, about resourcing long-term. I think there is more that's needed there. But a little bit to your last point, Amber, I think fundamentally, as NCATRIS described, I mean, this is a paradigm shift for our agency. This is building a muscle that we just haven't exercised as effectively as we should have, I would argue, in the past. And that's a muscle that we all 4,700 have to exercise and have to know is there. And that's not a perfect analogy by any stretch, but it is, I mean, the reality of the fact that the decisions happen at every level, and understanding that there are equity considerations to be thought about at every level of decisions. That is, you know, it's not going to be solved by a 50-person social equity staff, and the NCATRIS, you know, raise that, and I think we're all in agreement. It's really, how do you infuse this way of thinking, this recognition, from our right-of-way section to our maintenance crews to our project delivery folks to our planning folks, and to your point, how you opened your comment, I think the NCATRIS and team have done a tremendous job of doing that in a year and a half, and I'm feeling confident we're heading in that direction. That said, it is iterative, and I think there's more resources and a lot more work to do. But I would just echo the appreciation for NCATRIS. She doesn't need me to say it, but we certainly appreciate having her play the role that she's doing, because it's been tremendous. But I appreciate your points, Amber, very much. Amanda, do you have something you want to raise?
I was just going to talk just real briefly about being a division administrator within the organization, and then also the many facets of equity. And I would say, as a division administrator within the organization, I think we all recognize that it is our responsibility to help create this change. NCATRIS isn't just the Office of Social Equity led by NCATRIS. We are creating that cultural shift overall. And we all have a responsibility to play in that. And I think Director Strickler's done a pretty good job of setting up the expectation that it isn't kind of a one person or few person show. It is all of us, and we are accountable to that standard then. And then as we do that, I think we've had some good conversations at the leadership level too, of where and how do we do that within our sphere of influence and our direct work. And so like within my shop, the Oregon Transportation Plan is going to be key on how we set that equity conversation, how we create that definition, how we set not only our direction, but our expectations and accountability for that at the highest level that we can. So a lot of good work ahead. And it's been great partnering with McCotras on all of that.
My response would be word.
Yeah, I might chime in here as well, just to echo the thoughts already shared by Cooper and Amanda, and also say that as Nikatris described, there's the larger enterprise, the statewide enterprise conversation that she's speaking into and has got some momentum along the same lines. So I would say the multiplier, the multiplicative effects of these conversations is really starting to kick in. As you all know, I have the support organization that I'm responsible for within our agency. And again, our folks live in between the enterprise and the agency and are involved in conversations on multiple fronts. And the Nikatris, while a small team of 3, they're mighty and they're multipliers. And it's being seen each and every day, whether it's in the contracting conversations that our OPO has, our procurement office has, or in our HR channel when we're talking about recruitment and minimum qualifications for jobs and how we get out and recruit people of color into the workforce. It's having an impact on multiple levels. The other thing I'd mention that I didn't hear today, that we're in the second iteration of diversity and equity partners that Nikatris has stood up, and I think that's creating a force multiplier as well. So a number of great things going on, all stimulated by this very small team, but pretty significant momentum. And it's just, again, to continue to build that multiplier and establish that momentum more deeply that the external community is seeing and experiencing in a very real way.
I do want to say that, so yes, we have a very small team. I do say that, and I really do mean it. So I think it's important for people to know, based on a strong desire to see outcome as quickly as some would love to see outcome. We have made great progress. And also our team there are multiple people working on it. So right now we're working on figuring out how to better, I don't even want to say align. So what part of the Office of Civil Rights has done compliance around procurement and procurement's done compliance around procurement, right? They've been doing a lot of this for a long time. And so how do we shift some of our compliance thought and how we've typically done that and how we've typically reported it and how we push back or don't push back? How do we shift some of that, right? That might obviously still in compliance, but also pushes us to get to more equitable outcomes. And that work is just starting because we did an analysis first, we did an assessment first. Like, so we are at the very beginning, but also have made progress. But also I do want to know from this group if there's other things that you would like to see or how you would like to be plugged in or what that looks like. I know we've talked about that a couple of times. And I want to make sure that there's something that I'm consistently bringing to you if that makes sense to you around a piece that we are working on from the office.
Just a question, Nikatris. I know that one of our key goals is to diversify our workforce, and I think that is integral into changing the culture. And I know you've done work in that realm. Is there anything that you want from us in that regard, or are you finding challenges? Is there anything we can do to help in that particular segment of your work?
So at this moment, not that I can think of, I do think it's a place that we can definitely be held accountable. That is a metric that is so close to being finalized. So what we're going to do is utilize an index again called the choice score, looking at ODOT as a workplace of choice, some place that people would like to be because they would like to grow, because there's a sense of belonging, support, and a great place to work, right? So in doing that, we're looking at the following metrics around our recruitment, our hiring, our retention, our promotion, and then people's belonging at work. So that last piece is the piece we don't have because we're in the process of creating an engagement survey. We did our last one in 2015, and now we are in a place where we can use some of that and also create a platform that will allow us to do it continuously so that annually we can see what that looks like, where we've done well, also thinking about that engagement piece, because we know that as a missing piece of why people come and go, right? And so, and in the state, there was recently a report that talked about recruiting people to Oregon has not been necessarily difficult over the last few years, but retaining them in their positions has. And every company, no matter their size, has seen that. Government, private sector, the recruiting, but the retention has been really hard. And so looking at what we can do in that space, I do think that's a place that we could come back consistently and talk about how we're doing in that realm. We get monthly reports around some of those things. And then again, we'll have that annual choice index score of what it looks like for us to continue to make progress on all the things together.
I just want to say one other thing. I'll shut up. Commissioner Smith, I've been waiting for 20 years for this ODOT to show up.
Oh, good. Well, we're definitely making progress, but we are not there yet.
I know, but I'm like, oh, it's so fabulous.
Good.
I've been waiting for this ODOT to show up. It's exciting.
As we go forward, please let us know if you start seeing change, because it's, we need to hear from the outside folks.
It's already happening. It's
Okay.
already happening. It's already happening. That's what I mean. It's it's already happening. It's already happening. It's already happening.
Can you share like one thing that you've seen that you've noticed that for success?
Oh, I actually wrote a memo to y'all, to OTC, about some of the changes I've seen, and I'll have to find it. I mean, the things that have happened in the last, there's so many things that y'all do. I don't even think there's so many things that are changing that I think you can't see them, but I have seen the ODOT before this ODOT, and I know that ODOT, and this is what change looks like. Yeah, so I will find that and I will show it. I will send it to y'all.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, I just want to add one other thing. Thank you, Nikotris. How do you pronounce your name? I want to say it properly. Nikotris. Mm-hmm. So thank you so much for that presentation. The thing that's interesting to me is how issues of social equity and of climate change are inherently interdisciplinary. And I think, if we can train ourselves in each department to think about, sort of highlight those key questions in Nikotris's presentation, as well as some key questions around climate, and how do we start, that's the way you start to bring this thinking into all aspects of an organization. And it's really hard because I think there's a lot of people probably like an electric utility who are like, I don't have a role here. This isn't important to my job. And changing that culture and helping people understand how they do play a role and how their job is really important to promote greater social equity and to mitigate climate change, I think will help accelerate that really important cultural shift that needs to happen.
I will say that we definitely, that is something we know, and the climate office is way better at that right now than I am. The climate office is always like, we're about to do something. Are you ready to conscious? And I'm like, no, we have to do these other 3 things first. But it's definitely on our radar. So we do see where some of those intersections lie. And as a plan is made, like they did the action plan for 5 years. And so now we're going to do a blueprint, but not without thinking about the action plan and how it like overlaps. So it's definitely on our radar. And I'm confident that within the next 5 years, it'll all be seamlessly integrated. Because right now we're definitely often like 2 tabs on a spreadsheet. Like the cost estimating tool is a good example of that, where there's an equity tab, and there's also a climate tab, but there's intersections in there too. So it's on our radar. I can't say we're actively figuring out, but we are thinking about it, and we will figure it out.
I would assume there are several initiatives or emerging themes like climate and equity, but the intersection of equity across resilience and asset management and all of those things is really important when you connect it back to your strategic plan. So I think that's something I'm going to be watching for, is how this topic finds its way throughout the culture of everything ODOT does, because then you've really integrated the aspects of it.
That's great. Thank you, everyone. Maybe think about wrapping it up. Cooper, I'll throw it back to you for any kind of closing details.
All righty, thank you very much. Yeah, I appreciate the conversation as always. This is super helpful to hear. We'll bring, I think, both of these topics back. Thank you, Nikatris, for the last one, and thanks again to the climate team, the EB team, for the previous one. We'll also figure out how to get materials to the folks who weren't here, so they can maybe the recording, but we can work that offline to make sure that folks are prepared for the conversation next month. My apologies, I don't have the date of when the next meeting is, but hopefully it's on your calendar, but we'll be sending that around. It is next month. In the meantime, I think that is all of the housekeeping stuff. Again, really appreciate all of y'all's insights, your passion, enthusiasm, and thanks to the team for coming and setting the table with these great topics and all the work behind them. So with that, unless you got anything else, Commissioner.
No, thank you. I really appreciate all the feedback and the great work that we're doing. And we have a lot of work ahead of us. And so we'll just keep making progress. And we'll see you next week or next month. We should meet every week. But let's meet next month. Bye, everyone.